We are joined by none other than Humza Yousaf, the former First Minister of Scotland. So thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
I'm delighted to be here. Before we get into that question, just so you all know, in advance of this, Rebecca and the team said to me, look, you know, we've got Speaker Fest, we've got wonderful people from all across the world descending upon Oxford. We want to do this kind of 30-minute Q&A with you. And they must have sent me a list of about 100 pages of questions they wanted to get through.
Sorry.
And I said to Becca, if we get through that, you should probably chair the UN. So we're going to do our best to work our way through some of these questions. So I've just come, the reason I'm down here, not just to take part in Speaker Fest, but yesterday I was addressing the Oxford Union, which was great, and a great, lovely kind of opportunity, and one to tick off the list, and really blessed to be able to talk to the leaders of tomorrow. And this is the thing with those who study at Oxford University, who study PPE, most of them, they end up, politics, philosophy and economy, economics, they often end up sometimes as prime ministers, as cabinet ministers of the future, captains of industry, leading entrepreneurs, CEOs. So it's a great, wonderful opportunity to talk to them about some of what I've learned. I've been a government minister, so people know me as a former First Minister, but I've been in government for 12 years. Various different roles, justice, health, transport, and of course as First Minister. And along that journey on politics, I've learnt a lot of things of what to do and crucially what not to do.
So what did you say to them? What should they do and what shouldn't they do? What does it take to be a good leader, bad leader?
Well, a few things actually. First and foremost, I said to them, don't let anybody tell you that you're not good enough, regardless of what your background is. I entered politics and got elected at the age of 26 as one of only 2 people of colour in the entire parliament. And I was told throughout my career, you're too young, you're the wrong colour, you're the wrong religion, your name doesn't sound right. And I took each of those obstacles and objections as a reason to prove people wrong. Second piece of advice that I think is really important, and I would give this to you guys, it doesn't matter what your role is in life, what you're doing, whether it's working, whether you're busy with other commitments, is that you have to set your boundaries. People will call it a kind of work-life balance, but you have to set your boundaries. Because if you're working 24/7, you're only sleeping a few hours, your stress levels are through the roof, then you are not, you're not the best version of yourself, you'll make erratic decisions, your judgment will be clouded, and ultimately you're just not a very nice human being. And I learned that the hard way. You know, I talk about this quite openly. I had a mental health breakdown in 2016. Never spoke about it at the time, was too ashamed. Didn't tell the First Minister at the time. I was the Transport Secretary, didn't tell the First Minister at the time. Just total breakdown. Didn't move for 48 hours, didn't drink, didn't sleep. Mental health just imploded. And because I'd burnt both ends of the candle and lost relationships over it, lost a marriage over it actually, distant to my parents, my siblings. And from that moment, and through some very good counselling that I received at the time, realised, right, you're going to completely collapse here and not go any further unless you draw those boundaries. So actually drawing those boundaries makes you a much better leader, makes you a much better cabinet minister, makes you a much better employer, employee, student, but most importantly makes you a much better human being. There's lots of other things I said as well, but look, I appreciate we've got a short period of time. But those lessons in leadership, I think, are really important. Actually, the final thing, by the way, which I think is actually quite important. Politicians always do that. They say, I'm going to say the final thing and then there's one more.
We're still here, that's fine.
But there's one more, actually, which was really important for Oxford, but I think is something that's huge globally, is that we see the rise of populism right across the world. So we can pick any country and any continent in the world, and there's usually a populist movement that's either on the rise or in some cases very much in power. And across Europe, a lot of that populism is driven by the far right.
What does this mean for the world? Because I understand why people are grappling at straws. People want change. People want, I don't know, they're resonating with it for some reason. And it really is sort of taking over. You've got Keir Starmer, who's liberal, but otherwise there's so many leaders in the world that are right-wing, super right-wing. So what does this mean for the world now?
I raised my eyebrows slightly at description of Keir Starmer's liberal, but anyway.
Isn't he? Sorry.
I
South
I take the point. The rise of populist movements. So what is populism? Populism at its most basic is presenting very simple solutions to very complex problems. Because you can't be bothered getting into the complexity and you can't be bothered addressing the real systemic issues. So if I give you one example in the United Kingdom, housing. So chronic lack of housing in most of the United Kingdom, but particularly in London, England and the southeast. And what politicians have done over the years, successive governments, have blamed migration. Too many immigrants coming to this country, they're taking your housing, that's the problem. Very easy to do. Migrants can't fight back, can't counteract it. And so what you've got over 20, 30 years is a really strong, I'm afraid to say, anti-migrant sentiment in those parts of the country. What the real answer to the chronic lack of housing? Well, in 1979, you had 6.5 million council houses. You now have 2.5 million council houses. Because the governments have sold off council stock, usually through right to buy, but have sold off council stock and not replenished it. So what you've got is a complete failure from the political class to invest in housing, but the easy solution is blame it on the migrant. So what you've got is versions of that right across the world, kind of rise of populism, very simple solutions to very complex problems. And at the same time, to make the storm even worse, is you've got people's living standards in a lot of countries just falling off the edge of a cliff. And in fact, the biggest drop in living standards in the United Kingdom took place under the last UK government since records began. So you've got this perfect storm, perfect mix of factors colliding together. And we're liberals, and I count myself as kind of liberal, progressive, centre-left politician, where we've utterly failed, and you saw this in the United States, hence the conversation with Bridget a moment ago, is those in my position have failed miserably to articulate what a hopeful vision for the future is, that is the alternative to the populist vision. What we talk about is issues that I'm afraid don't resonate with most of the public. We get stuck into a quagmire of identity politics, and that's not to take away the importance. I'm a big supporter of trans rights, I'm a big supporter of LGBT rights, equal rights, equality, multiculturalism. All these things are things that naturally I'm a supporter of. But we've become so entrenched into a quagmire of that type of issue that we're not addressing Mrs. Smith, whose energy bills have gone up, quadrupled in the last year. And by the way, her Tesco shop has doubled. And by the way, the price to fill up her car has tripled in the last year. So again, forgive me, it's a long answer to your very short question, but the antidote is values-based, but also articulating a vision, which we've singularly failed to articulate.
And leaders are so divisive. So someone like Trump, for example, is very divisive and sort of stirs that pot even more. How can we get away from that? How can we bring people together as opposed to apart? What would your advice be or thoughts on that? And what does that mean for the world too?
Yeah, I mean, that's $1 million question. So for me, politicians have to lead by example. So if I give you a very kind of divisive stroke thorny issue in Scotland, that would be the Scottish independence referendum. Yeah. So you've got 50% of the population who support it, 50% who are against it. Virtually every poll puts it at 50-50. So you're split right down the middle. And that can often be in households. One parent believes in it, the other parent disagrees. So, you know, in my family, most of my family support, I'm pleased to say, but, you know, you'll have some who disagree with independence. So split right down the middle. And it can be quite, and I'm the first to admit, it can be quite tricky, quite divisive at times. But what we've got to try to do is stop seeing the person who's on the opposite side of us as the enemy. So what, again, I was saying to Bridget before coming in here was, if I was to take one lesson from the United States, we've just had that, again, very divisive election. If I was to think about the rise of reform in the United Kingdom, which is happening and going to continue to happen, the worst thing I could do, and politicians like-minded to me who are worried about the threat of reform, is to say to anybody who sympathises with reform or is a potential reform voter or is a reform voter, is that you're all just a bunch of racist fascists. Completely divisive. Now, don't get me wrong, I've got very set opinions that I'll articulate about Nigel Farage, because I think he is dangerous and toxic in our politics. But if I went to every reform voter and said, by the way, how dare you, knock the door, you know, you're just a racist, of course, again, poor Mrs. Smith, she's getting a bad name, but Mrs. Smith is not a racist. She might support Nigel Farage and reform, but she does it because she wants to give the establishment a proverbial kick in the nether regions. That's what she wants to do because, again, her daily cost of living has skyrocketed through the roof. And so I think the antidote is not to call the other side a whole bunch of names, but to try to genuinely understand, well, why are people drifting in that direction? How do we work with them? How do we articulate a more positive vision of what we're doing? And understand that whatever happens and whatever in a democracy people vote for, we've got to accept the result and actually give people a shot of governing as opposed to opposing for the sake of opposition.
Yeah, conflict resolution.
Yeah.
Which is what you talk about a lot too.
Yeah.
So in a world today, shifting a little bit more towards geopolitics, where there are so many wars going on, there's a lot of political upheaval in the world. People are scared, people are anxious. What has to happen to see a more peaceful world in 2025? Why is the UN, which I may chair one day, I don't know, not actually achieving what it should? Why is it failing? How can we change that and see peace in the world?
Yeah. Well, Secretary General, the response.
Thank you.
The response to that. So first, I think the effort has to focus on prevention of conflict. So conflict resolution and mediation is absolutely an area where I have a huge interest in doing little pieces of work here and there. But the prevention of conflict has to be the first goal, not just trying to fix conflict once it already starts, because that's far more difficult. So getting in early into areas where tensions possibly are rising over land, over resource, over one people's claim for sovereignty, whatever it is, the global community isn't putting enough effort into conflict prevention as opposed to resolution. And we have enough very intelligent, emotionally intelligent people in the world to help with that task. So there has to be somebody who takes that bull by the horns and says, we are going to be the world leaders in the way that Switzerland are world renowned for conflict mediation, Qatar really moving into that space as well. Who's going to grab the bull by the horns and say, we are the country that will train the next generation of conflict preventers? And that conflict prevention and resolution as well all relies on the art of diplomacy and compromise.
And we've lost the art of diplomacy.
Completely lost the art of compromise, diplomacy, because partly of the toxic nature of our political discourse, but also, to be frank, and you reference the United Nations and other multilateral institutions, international law, it feels like now is not worth the paper it's written on. So an issue very close to my heart that I've been outspoken on is the atrocities in Gaza. If I thought about that issue for just a moment, I tried to be as objective as I can, and that can be difficult. I have some family, wife's family who are there, but if I try to be as objective as I possibly can on that issue, you've got, again, by UN studies, over 45,000 people who've been killed there, and the majority, 70%, or almost 70%, I think 68%, are women and children. So by any objective standard, international law and multilateral institutions would have stopped that atrocity a long time ago, many, many months ago.
But how can they stop it?
Well, this is the point I'll get to. No, it's a very good question. It's by applying international law, with no exception. So international law should apply equally. International law should apply to Hamas, and it should apply to the Israeli government, equally. So anybody who commits an atrocity like Hamas does, they should be in the dock and be put on trial. And anybody that commits a war crime like Netanyahu has, then should be in the dock and put on trial. But if you begin as the United States or the United Kingdom or European Union or any Arab country, if you begin to pick and choose who international law applies to, then you make it completely worthless. And that is the trouble and the problem. Whereas actually, if we, as an international community, this is hard, how do you do it? If the international community said, actually, we've all signed up to international law, be it to the Rome Statute, to this, to that, to the other, and we are going to apply it, including to our allies, as much as to our enemies, then you actually begin to have a world where people are held to account for the atrocities and believe that they'll be held. If you believe you've got impunity, so this is sort of the final point I'll make on this question. If you believe that international law won't be upheld or enforced, what's stopping you? Where's the disincentive for war? Because if I'm a warlord, if I am a rogue army general in any country that has a vast amount of resources, I might fancy my chances at war. I've got a bigger army, I've got troops, I've got mercenaries, I've got some weapons, and the prize is huge. And what's the disincentive? If international law is not going to be applied to me, well, I'll not be held to account, so that's okay. The law of the land, if I win the war, I am the law of the land, that's okay. And by the way, there's billions to be made out of it because I'll control the country's resources. So if international law is to mean anything, then it has to be applied equally, and we've lost the equal application of international law, which is the problem.
So looking at Trump being in, talking about war and stuff, how do you think it will impact Russia, like the US relation with Russia, China?
Yeah. Look, it's going to sound unusual coming from somebody of my political stance, but I think he has to be given a chance.
Yeah.
You know, he got a popular mandate. He won the election relatively comprehensively, a bit closer than people thought in the beginning, but he's won the election. He should now be allowed to get on with what he's promised to do. There's a kind of hopeful vision and there's, I suppose, a more pessimistic vision. The more pessimistic will say that he'll defend his allies only, the world will become far more divisive, he'll not respect international law, and there's a real fear about all of that. And then there's maybe a more hopeful one which says actually he probably doesn't want a whole bunch of US tax dollars being spent on foreign wars, and therefore, and he's a businessman and he likes doing deals and he likes to be the negotiator, and maybe he'll come in and he'll use some of that and say, well, you know, you're not going to get funded for XYZ war continually. Now that can be dangerous because we should, and I'm a great supporter of Ukraine and the government of Ukraine and the people of Ukraine. You could end up the price of that being too high. The US might say, I'm sorry to Zelensky, we're not going to keep funding you to the tune of tens of billions of US dollars. You've got this much that'll last you for this long, and the deal has to be done, which means you've got to cede some of your territory, which would be, in my view, a horrendous signal to send to Russia that you can again annex another land with impunity and not suffer any consequences as a result. So, again, kind of long and short, I think we've got to watch the space, but I don't think we can just say from the off, Donald Trump will be an absolute disaster. I think he's won the right. Vote for him, didn't vote for him, like him, loathe him. He's won the right to govern, and he should be given a chance to get on with it. So you've got all these proxy wars being fought, and the worry in the world is that continues to happen. But all it takes is one leader who's erratic, and we have plenty of them, to just do something so catastrophic that it probably lights the touch fuse. You could absolutely envisage a world war again. And the entire point, of course, of the United Nations was built from the ashes of World War II to prevent conflict on that scale taking place. And I think it's fair to say that they've miserably failed. Well, actually, maybe that's wrong because they prevented a world war, but they are miserably failing at the moment to control and contain war and conflict across the globe.
How can the United Nations deal with someone like Putin, though, who's so incredibly erratic and unpredictable and actually does not care? He is above all law in his eyes. So it's it's quite hard when dealing with that sort of character.
Yeah, look, it's not easy, and I don't want to pretend to present kind of very easy solutions, as I've always said, to very complex problems. That would be wrong to do. But again, if we genuinely applied international law, if we applied it equally, Russia was isolated in a way that it has been, I think, since the Ukraine aggression. How do you make sure that they feel the pressure upon them, that they're isolated, they can't go anywhere, which is not the case with Vladimir Putin. He can still travel to countries who are allies. To Africa, as we've seen, to Mongolia, as we've seen. He can host something like the BRICS summit, one of the biggest world summits of the year. He can host it, and many leaders will go there.
He hasn't actually been alienated to.
He's not been alienated to the extent that he should be, in a way that, for example, we did with South Africa, a country very close to your heart, obviously. We did with South Africa in the kind of 1980s and 90s during the apartheid regime. They were persona non grata and made to feel that, and eventually declared.
And it seemed it worked. There was obviously uprising, but we're not going to get into South African politics right now. Okay, so
not my area of expertise, I'm afraid.
So we are out of time for our discussion, unfortunately, but you guys are so lucky again that there's a Q&A. So please do, the floor's yours. Tatiana.
You speak about this importance of implementing international law, and I agree, but I feel like we're entering an area of realpolitik as opposed to like liberal internationalist order that we actually need in order to move forward. And I live in Asia, and there you see, and with the rise of Trump, this has gotten even worse in the sense of the strongman politics driven purely by opportunity, often cases cronyism, and sort of economic enrichment, not necessarily for themselves, but for their own country. And you see that in the Middle East as well, like Saudi, UAE, they operate on a realpolitik. They don't really have an ideology. So is it actually possible right now to have an order that is based on international law?
Yeah, look, we can either become fatalistic about it and say it's not, and then the whole world becomes fatalistic and this is a spiral of doom, and we can all just call it a night. Or we can say that there's an antidote to that. And there are many countries across the world, actually, where that strongman vision is not applied, and they're some of the happiest countries in the world. So what are the happiest countries in the world? Norway, Scandinavian, right? Somebody says Scandinavian. So your Scandinavian countries, usually your Norways, your Swedens, your Finlands, your Icelands, tend to be the happiest places in the world. Usually have a good GDP per head as well. Usually have a decent social policy. Fewer areas of deprivation, whereas the United Kingdom is described by the Financial Times as a very poor country with pockets of very rich people. So what we've got to do is, goes back to my point to Becca, is how do we create what the alternative hopeful vision is? And by the way, that doesn't mean what people associate with liberalism, or you can just change your identity into a cat or something, right? That's what people associate wrongly with what a liberal progressive agenda is. So we have to be able to articulate that. If I was to go to one other area where I've got an interest, and this is a much more longer term, this is not short term, is we haven't really dealt with toxic masculinity, or what I prefer to call promoting positive masculinity. So I'm a father of 3 girls, 3 gorgeous, beautiful girls who've got a very strong identity. Well, 2 of them do. One's 4-month-old, but I suspect she'll get very strong female identity. Now that's largely driven by her parents, our mother obviously, but I could go to the bookshelf in my 5-year-old's room, and she's got a book called Rebel Girls, right? Strong women, role models. She's got the Malala Yousafzai book. She's actually got Kamala Harris one as well, but we'll talk less about that. She's got a few books, so she's got a really strong role model in her mother of what a strong female is, an independent, strong female. She's got the materials that she can read, and we go through it. Every cartoon she watches or program that she watches, there's usually a strong female in that, usually as the lead character. And if I was to flip that, and if I was to say, well, what does a strong, positive male identity look like? I don't think I've got the answer. And that's not to say people haven't tried, but I don't know the answer to it. And so part of what I wanted to do as First Minister, unfortunately time was shorter in that office than I would have liked, but what I tried to do was begin to start the conversation, which says, look, you can be a strong man, you can have the muscles, you can have the cars, you can have the women if that's what you want, you can have the men, whatever you want, that's all fine. But frankly, and forgive my French again, you don't have to be a dick, right? You don't have to abuse women, be a misogynist prick, be somebody. Sorry, forgive me, am I swearing too much?
Oh no, sorry, I was giving you snaps.
It's the Glaswegian.
I was like, yeah.
You can take the boy out of Glasgow.
No, I wasn't. Sorry.
But not
Gen Z, sorry.
But not Glasgow out the boy. But you don't need to be that particular. You don't need to be Andrew Tate. And also, that's not just what the male identity has to be. It can be other things too. But what we've not created is that. So I would love to do a piece of work. In fact, I'm thinking about how I do it with 1 or 2 others, former leaders as well, around positive male role models, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it comes down to role models too.
Massively.
Okay. Rebecca.
You just chose her because she got the same name as you.
I promise I wasn't.
Favoritism.
I wasn't clicking you, I was
Yeah.
snapping.
No,
I was
that's-
snapping.
Hello, hi there. You talk about the importance of understanding and listening to opposing views. And you mentioned earlier the Oxford Union, which is this highly regarded institution, this incredible training ground for future leaders, so hugely important. But I was very concerned to hear that a recent debate organised by Oxford Union had been breached by bigotry and hatred. So my question to you is, how do we uphold open and fair and honest debate when experts with opposing views who come to debates with intellectual rigour and a balanced argument are met with open and blatant bias?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Good question.
By the way, in a debate, bias isn't a problem. That's the entire point of a debate, is one people have a certain biased view and other people have a different biased view and they collide in the debate. Hatred is a problem. So I think you're referring to the Israeli debate. I think the debate was, if I remember, the motion was Israel is committing a genocide and is an apartheid state. And you have people who would agree with that sentiment, myself, you'd have others that would disagree with that sentiment, and they should be able to debate that. And I think it's almost beyond debate. I mean, we've got an ICJ advisory opinion that says that Israel has to stop any acts that could be interpreted as genocide. And you've also got an ICJ opinion that says they have breached the Apartheid Convention. But anyway, I'm not getting into debate. This is my view. And there'll be opposing sides which say actually they're defending the self-defense and they're defending themselves, and that is legitimate and it's Hamas's fault and so on and so forth. What you got, and I don't know the hatred you're talking about, though the video is being released today, the one clip I saw was awful, was one of the speakers saying that Palestinians are less than human, which I thought was just it was an awful suggestion. But the guy who said it is certifiably mad, actually. But and why he was invited, I don't know. And this goes to the point, your point. We have probably lost the art of disagreeing agreeably, and there's probably lots of reasons for it. I think social media plays a big part. I mean, you've got people who would never be given a platform or the time of day, quite rightly, now having sometimes millions of followers, because the whole purpose of social media is what? To get likes, followers and views. And you don't get likes, followers and views looking down the camera, speaking for 5 minutes about the medium-term financial strategy. Trust me, I've tried and failed miserably. What you do is you get views, likes and followers by being quite sensationalist and having kind of sound bites. It goes back to that kind of simple solution to very complex problems. Let me go back to the union or university. We live in, we kind of have this phrase, don't we, nowadays called cancel culture. People feel they get cancelled. And I think we've got to allow opinion to be expressed, not when it crosses a line into hatred. And we've got quite actually strong rules and laws around hatred in the United Kingdom, both in England and separately in Scotland. But if you don't cross into hatred, just being downright racist or homophobic, if you keep it within the parameters of the law, which I don't think is an unreasonable ask, if you keep it within the parameters of the law, universities should be a place that absolutely foster debate and shouldn't be afraid of debate and should invite people who can be disagreeable as long as they are within the confines of the law. So I actually applaud Oxford Union for bringing forward that motion. I think it's great. They should have speakers on each side. They should go at it hammer and tongs without, as I say, drifting into kind of breaching hatred. And when that does happen, they have to be absolutely clear about how unacceptable that is. But just as much as they've had, so the Oxford Union has hosted Ronald Reagan and Bernie Sanders before, right? They're a union that's had Winston Churchill and Jeremy Corbyn, Theresa May and Shakira, which is a bit of an odd one, but anyway. So they've had people of kind of different political persuasions, and that's the way a university should be. Our young people, doesn't matter whether it's Oxford or Glasgow University or LSE or Aberdeen University, whatever the university is. University is a wonderful place, not just for young people, obviously as mature students, but particularly for young people who are growing, maturing, developing, they should have access to people who challenge them. And then it's for them to decide which way they go in life. So, yeah, I think there's parameters. So long as you're within those legal parameters, anything should go.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time.
That's it.
Humza will be outside during the break, which will commence after this. So you can ask him questions like who books him, what kind of speaking engagements he does, stuff that you would really like to know like after this. But to wrap things up, thank you. I think you're incredibly candid, you're real, and it's lovely to see a politician willing to speak about these sort of subjects in a real, honest way.
Pleasure.
So thank you for sharing your voice.
Pleasure,
And
thanks
thank you
for
for joining us today. It's greatly appreciated.
Not at all. Pleasure,
Thank
pleasure,
you.
pleasure, and I look forward to engaging with you.
Thank you, Humza.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll put in a good word with the Secretary General. I'm going to see him next.